Welcome back to Bio Insights. Today, what we're going to be talking about is programming for chaos, looking at asymmetrical loading and neuroplastic scars. So, to help us understand that, uh, we have back joining us today Dr. Paul Juris, and he sent me this article that we'll talk about here shortly. But to give you, the listener, a little bit better of an understanding, or the coach or the trainer or the operator, think of a member or an athlete that's torn the ACL and they've done their 9 months of rehab. They have perfect surgical repair, quad and hamstring strength, fully restored, symmetrical, textbook, right? So they go back into the field or they go back to their race or they go play a pickup game of basketball. And within their first week or first season, they tear that same knee again. Not the other one, which statistically has an 80% chance of tearing as well. But it's the same one. So for years, fitness and rehab, the rehab industry specifically, has treated that as just bad luck or incomplete rehab, or the client who came back too soon. So the research says something more specific is going on. So the ligament heals, right? The nervous system does not automatically heal with it. It leaves what the literature calls neuroplastic scar. And that scar changes how the brain manages the movement itself. Um, and after the knee is cleared, you know, there is, this thread that we're trying to connect, how the body should be trained and how it should be handled. So we're going to talk about asymmetrical load. We're going to talk about how the brain processes that load. And I thought of, again, Dr. Juris shared that article with me. So to help us get us started, I want to set that framework and talk about, you know, a level deeper, based on our previous discussions. We've been talking about other variables here in our previous discussions. We have talked about asymmetrical loading, but we want to talk about how the system manages the load and when the environment stops cooperating. So before we get into the brain side of things, I want to start that ground discussion with Dr. Juris.
Thank you, Marcelo. I think, what you're sort of tapping into here, especially with the ACL and rehabilitation, is what is the effect of cognitive load on motor output and motor performance? And so neuroplasticity, cognitive load, I think we sometimes consider that only in the context of aging. So as we age, we need to improve our neuroplasticity, but it also is relevant to high performance conditions, to high stress conditions. And there are a lot of different anecdotes that we can talk about, which sort of give us insights into, well, what happens to our ability to move when we're overloading our brain with information? And I think this is it's a great thing to explore because it is one of those things where when we're training people for strength, for example, we're always looking for, well, how much more volume can I add? And we've talked about volume in the past, right? But how much more load? How much more volume? What can I
Yeah.
do, in order to make this more intense? And what this is all kind of coming to the conclusion is you don't always have to increase the volume and the intensity. What you can do is change the cognitive demand of a task, and it makes it a completely different challenge. And it's a really good way of sort of snapping people out of a plateau or getting them to change their strength or the behavior. So it's a really good topic to get into.
Yeah, the study that you sent me really was, it was a neural mapping study that uses strength training as an independent variable, right? So
Yes.
it uses the device controls for compensation. So which a lot is similar to the work, right? So in plain terms, what does it actually show?
All right. Well, let me kind of set the stage a little bit so that we can understand what's going on. And it's it's funny. I was actually doing this in the gym the other day, and this is actually very funny. So what what asymmetrical loading is, or what some another term that's used is offset loading, is when you are doing an exercise, and this is traditionally done with the upper body. So we'll get to the cognitive load aspects later when we talk about ACL rehab and things like that. But these are studies done with the upper body. So let's say you're doing a dumbbell chest press. And what you do is you put, let's say, a 20-pound dumbbell in your right hand and a 10-pound dumbbell in your left hand. That's an offset load. It's one side's heavier than the other, and you're doing it deliberately. So, like I said, I was doing this in the gym the other day. Now, you can do this with dumbbells. I like using plate-loaded machines, like isolateral plate-loaded, where you have independent limbs. It's a great way to do it. So I was doing it in the gym. I was doing an overhead press with it. I had I think a 25-pounder on one side and a 10-pounder on the other side. And a person walks up to me and says, "Hey, do you know you have different weights?" And I'm like,
Really?
well,
Oh
I
my
do
God.
now. So here's the scenario. This is really fascinating. It starts with Newton's second law of motion. That's the law of acceleration, right? We've talked about this too. Law of acceleration says that acceleration is directly proportional to the force that you produce and inversely proportional to the mass that you're trying to accelerate. In other words, the heavier it goes, the heavier the weight is, the slower the rate of acceleration. The lighter it is, the faster the rate of acceleration. Okay, so let's say I'm doing an overhead press and I have a 20-pound dumbbell in my right hand and a 10-pound dumbbell in my left hand. By Newton's second law of motion, if I'm doing that press, the lighter weight, the 10-pound dumbbell, should get to the top much faster than the 20-pounder, right? That's the law of acceleration. When you do the first repetition of a set, there is a slight difference in how they go, but after that first repetition, they both get to the end point at the exact same time. Even though one is 20 pounds or twice as heavy as the other one, they both get to the end point at the same time. And so what your brain is doing is it's controlling the force output and mapping the positional change of the limbs all the way through so that you get there together. That's what we're talking about here in terms of what's going on in the system to control that. And when you do that in a strength training exercise, you're introducing a whole different level of cognitive control, which really challenges the system to be more focused, more aware, and it really increases cross connectivity and neural pathways in the brain.
And the studies show majority of it is that it actually produces more strength than symmetrical loading, right? Why is that the case? Is it because, you gave, I think, you gave the example in the first rep, right? Your brain has to work harder, so it's quote unquote still more novel. So you're stimulating more muscle. You have to re-coordinate everything. It's basically almost like you've never lifted before.
Yeah, we all know from past research that for someone who's starting out in strength training, the first few weeks of strength gains are what we call neural adaptation. I mean, that's become almost cliche. Anybody who's been in the industry knows to say it's neural adaptation. What that neural adaptation is, I don't know that, many people can explain, but it is neural adaptation. But this is a different kind of neural adaptation. So this is triggering. And what I've seen, by the way, this study just came out, and it's a great study, by the way. It was done at the University of Houston. It's really, really good. Um, but I've been doing this for like 20 years. I started doing this 20 years ago. And what you see is that your overall strength improves significantly. And that's really interesting. It's like you're going to get a better strength outcome doing this for 6 weeks than you would from doing symmetrically loaded exercises for that same 6 week period. It's really phenomenal. I mean, it's not something that you're always going to do because if you did it all the time, eventually the brain is just, okay, I got this. But you want to do this as a sort of a mesocycle or even a microcycle so that what you're doing is introducing a new stimulus. So yeah, this study was just mapping the brain and it looked at two areas of the brain. It's prefrontal cortex, which is the front of the brain, and that's connection to the sensory motor area, and parietal cortex, which is the side of the brain, and its connection to sensory motor function. And together, what they're doing is changing the outcomes of, how the motor system is innervated in order to get going.
And I think that's the important take home for a lot of people. It's the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, right? So if you're trying to, if you're trying to change your health, your longevity, or your performance in the field of play, you know, you're trying to in, increase your chances for better outcomes. And I think it's another tool in the toolbox, like we talked about wave loading
Hmm.
in the previous episode, where we talked about how the benefits are to the neural drive. A lot of people, some people use this tool to offset work to try to fix really that side by side deficit. Do you buy that, or does symmetrical usually persist even when overall strength goes up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have spoken to people who think that doing offset loading can make up a bilateral strength deficit. And I don't see that. And the reason is that the central nervous system, is always going to increase the drive to the side that is heavier. So, sure, when you have the heavier weight on your, let's say, your non dominant side, um, it will increase the drive to that side. But when the idea is to flip this, by the way. And let me just step back for 1 second. What really triggers the change is not the fact that there's a different load from side to side. Like you do 2 sets with that structure, but then after those 2 sets, you flip it. So you put the heavier weight on the opposite side. So you just change that over. And now the brain, which has now figured out, okay, the right side's heavier, the left side's lighter. I've done 2 sets of that. Now suddenly it changes. And when you try to move these things, it's going, wait a minute, what just happened? And it has to accommodate the flip. That is what really stimulates the neural change. So when you flip it, now you're putting the heavier side on your dominant limb. And it's going to overstimulate that side in order to accommodate or to manage that weight. So if there's a bilateral deficit, it's not going to change. Your dominant side is always going to be stronger than your non-dominant side when you do this, but the overall strength increases. And by the way, if you really want to make up a bilateral deficit, just do unilateral sets on the weaker side and do more sets. And this is something that we talk about ACL rehabilitation. When I was working with ACL patients, we always did both legs, but I would do like 3 sets on the uninvolved leg and I would do 10 sets on the involved leg and make it up in terms of volume and intensity. And then you start to see improvements in symmetry.
So the body's built to tolerate this kind of chaos, I like to call it. Is
Yeah.
the structure seems sound. Why does an athlete still freeze or stumble or blow out that joint that's fully rehabbed?
Well, that's that's a complicated it's a complicated question. So the first thing that I would ask is, are they really fully rehabbed? And this is, we've talked about this as well. It's like, well, what are the discharge criteria for an athlete coming out? And Are the tests that we're using really measuring their capacity to perform in different highly intense, demanding conditions? And that's another question. But there's what happens to the system when it's overloaded with information is the motor control functions start to sort of break down, is one way of putting it. And the walking lunge scenario, I think, speaks to that. Um, and it's mind-boggling to trainers, and there are different ways that we can do this, but there's if everybody can pretty much do walking lunges. I mean, ask anyone to do them,
Yeah.
pretty much get it right. Maybe it's not perfect biomechanically, but most people can do continuous walking lunges. But then you ask them to do it subtracting serial sevens starting at 100. So what it means is they start counting at 100 and they go backwards by 7, which is you might get to 93 and then you get to 86 and then you're like, wait, what is the next one? And what happens when you watch people doing that, all of a sudden they stop moving. Like literally this very fluid walking lunge that they were able to do suddenly looks like this person is broken and they can't move at all.
So you didn't disturb necessarily the independent variable being the load. You
Nope,
interrupted the brain. So
that's
it's a
right.
task effect in this.
Absolutely.
So,
It's a cognitive load. So what happens in that situation is the brain, all of a sudden, it's got to choose between which function it wants to control more. Right now, walking is actually managed by something called central pattern generators. So those are low-level control circuits in the spinal cord that really work at distal pathways to maintain an ongoing repetitive task like walking. Now, once you have to walk uphill or if you have to avoid something, and we can get into reaction response type of stuff, then the central pattern generators are not able to really exert that much more control. It's just the constant level, repetitive task. So that's easy to do. But once things become more challenging and you're trying to subtract these numbers in your head, and that becomes the task that the brain is almost strictly focused on, then all of a sudden the rest of it is not being well controlled anymore, and things start to fall apart.
this could be referred to as kind of a dual task effect, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I
So,
mean, dual task, you could have a triple task. You could throw as many tasks as you want in there. The way that I refer to it is it's a cognitive load. It's how much information am I having to process in order to be able to perform this? And it's kind of it's unnerving to see how quickly our motor skills break down when we're overloaded cognitively.
and this is something that, we talked about before, like dynapnea and, the effect of you're fighting basically aging daily, right, from birth. So, what, why does the brain protect then that spatial control and sacrifice timing then? Because you brought up stride, you talked about dual task. It, timing falls apart. Why?
Well, what's really interesting, it's in that case, it's not so much timing, it's just the rhythmic control of the motion that suddenly stops. I mean, I've literally, when I give people this task to do, and they're when I say just do your walking lunges, they do them perfectly, and they're like, "Oh, what a great! Look at how beautiful I did." And then when I ask them to do, the counting, they literally stop moving. Like they'll lower themselves into the first step, and then they're stuck there as they're trying to figure this
Do
thing
the
out.
math.
Yeah, it's like they're just done. Now, is that a timing issue? Yeah, no, it's just like a rhythmic control problem of that they can't manage both tasks at the same time. So let's flip this to a slightly different scenario, and then we'll get into timing.
Yeah.
So have somebody doing repetitive step ups on a box. All right. It's just you put a foot up on the box. You don't take it off and step back up. Leave the foot up. Let's say it's a 6-inch box. You're doing a forward step up onto the box and just have somebody doing that. Okay. They're going to be able to do that reasonably well once they get a rhythm going, once they understand what's going on there. Now, what you do is toss a ball up there while they're doing it. So as they're doing the step up exercise, you're going to toss a ball. It could be a tennis ball, a medicine ball, whatever kind of ball you want. What happens is the person will adjust the timing of their step up so that they get to the top of the step the moment the ball arrives. So now they're actually managing the temporal aspect of that movement so that you're coincidental with this object. And it makes it easier to catch the ball if that's the goal, right? So you could see this all the time. It's like when you start tossing that thing out there, people are going to time it so that they're getting up there at exactly the time that the ball arrives. So if you're going to train somebody, I'll just throw this back at you. If you're going to train somebody, what do you do to make it more of an open skill? What do you do to make it less predictable?
Yeah, dual task work. I love using blaze pods. You'll see I have them standing like right behind
Love
me.
blaze pots. They're
So
great tools.
the light reaction solution, I can also measure it. It's like, hey, I want you with your left hand only touch the red light, with your right hand only touch the blue light. And oh, by the way, you're going to have two distracting lights. So you have 30 seconds to do this task. I want you to do your regular step up, but now I'm going to have these four lights up here on the wall. Ready? Go. So, I would implement it into a program design, like you said, only maybe 2 weeks or a 4 week dose of it, and not all the time, maybe every third or fourth workout. And not only do it in a step up, but maybe holding a plank and actually doing that as well, incorporating it where it's more not really about a strength outcome, but it's more about uh, balance and coordination and the brain itself, like because those are get trimmed when you don't use them. So that's how I would do it. And what I like about using something like a blaze pod or a lighting system, there's many out there, is that I can get that measurable outcome. So I can show them. I could have an objective measuring tool. I use different tools like heart rate or whatever. The goal again is the outcome, but that objective tool helps me have that come to Jesus conversation.
And those are amazing. I love blaze pods. I think they're absolutely fantastic. And what you're tapping into there in terms of giving them specific color triggers or dummy triggers, right, is what we call choice response or choice reaction. It's not only it's sort of like a light goes on and you move. All right. You see the light go on and you move. But this one's a little bit more complicated than that. This one is if this light goes on, you move here. If this light goes on, you move there. But if this light goes on, you don't move at all. And so now it's forcing the individual to process that information in order to really control and manage this task, increasing information processing, increasing cognitive load. That's what really enhances performance. Getting back to the ball scenario, if I were going to do it, what I would do is change the pace at which I toss the ball to them. Because if they're timing the step so that they're getting up there when the ball arrives, well, I'm going to change when the ball arrives. So
Okay.
now they're really being thrown off and having to try to control their movement by watching that ball and understanding, well, how fast is that ball moving? Because depending on that, it's going to change how much force I apply into the step in order to get up there when I need to.
Yeah, the other tool that I've seen used are tennis balls, where you throw it out and you could only bounce once. I want you, and you can do fakes and go, whoops, and they have to react to it. So the brain processing speed actually looks like it in practice, but we're adding that variable along with the load, so, we're trying to mimic what the natural environment would look like in the field of play, coming off traffic, trying to step onto the sidewalk as an example. There's all these variables, and at the end of the day, we're trying to mitigate any type of negative outcome.
Yeah, and again, so yes, I had this conversation yesterday with a physical therapist friend of mine. We were talking about open and closed skills, and in large part, that's what this is really about. So, open and closed skills is not the same as open closed chain. We've already had that conversation. Um, Open and closed skills refer to the degree of predictability of any particular skill in which you're engaged. How predictable is it? How certain is it? So, as
Okay.
an example, we were talking about basketball free throw shooting, and that's what we call a closed skill. Why? Because the basket's not moving. It's 15 feet from the foul line. It's 10 feet off the floor. It's got the same diameter. It's not moving around in space. It is absolutely perfectly predictable. All the other stuff going around you creates noise. But the fact is that that basket's not moving anywhere when you're shooting at it. And so it's a closed skill. Bowling is a similar thing, right? The pins are there and the lane is as long as it is and as wide as it is. It's not changing. So it changes from ball to ball, but that's called intertrial variability. Um, but so what we're talking about here is creating more open environments where things become less predictable. Here's another example. You talk about ACL rehab. What a lot of people do is do balance training and stability training using a medicine ball rebounder. Right.
Okay.
So we've seen this a lot, right? You stand on one leg, you want to maintain your balance on that leg. You've got a medicine ball, you throw it against the rebounder and it comes back and you have to catch it. Great,
Yep.
great activity, great exercise. But here's the problem. When you're throwing it to yourself, you know how hard you threw it against the rebounder. You know where you threw it against the rebounder. So pretty much you know where it's coming back to you and how long it's going to take to get there and how much force it's going to hit you with. You can predict all of that stuff before you ever throw the ball at the rebounder. So it has limited benefit over time. Initially, it works well, but eventually you've got it figured out. So you have to introduce variability. You cannot continue to do that. So when I was working with ACL patients, I never used the rebounder. I just tossed it to them and I would toss it harder, softer. I'd toss it to the left. I'd toss it to the right. And as you say, fake it. I'm going to fake it one way and toss it the other way. Then I'll toss two balls at them to see what happens. So that's the kind of thing that you do to change this environment so that the spatial and temporal aspects of it become less predictable, less certain, more challenging.
So, to kind of explain, we threw a term before, neuroplastic scar. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what is it and why basically? Because, you know, the ACL tear, it leaves a neuroplastic scar, not just a physical one, you know. So why does an athlete, you know, depend on these mechanisms that, so we got to, it's not just a weak muscle, right? How do we explain that effectively to make them understand these tools and what the outcome is?
So most of that is sort of addressing the proprioceptive capability or capacity of the system, right? How is the sensory apparatus working, or how well is the sensory apparatus working to understand the joint position and velocity, the forces acting on the joint, compressive, shear, tension, however you want to look at those forces, is the proprioceptive mechanism acute enough so that the system can respond quickly and efficiently to the loading and stressors that are placed on it? And in many cases, when you have these disruptive injuries that require reconstruction, we lose some of that proprioceptive ability. What the study we were referencing is talking about, especially as it relates to parietal cortex and linked to sensory motor function, that's really kind of the GPS of the system. That is controlling spatial awareness, so that we can move effectively. And if we lose some capacity, we're not going to be totally incapacitated. But if we lose some capacity to do that when we're in high stress, high demand environments, we're going to have a deficit, which could lead to um, remorbidity of that injury, right? So re-injury. And that's really something to think about. A lot of that has to do with physiological stress. So uh, there's a professor at Coventry University in England. His name is Michael Duncan, and I spent some time with him there. And he did this really fascinating study. He had this device which was a ramped light. It was a ramp that was curved, and along this ramp were a series of lights, and it was oriented toward the person who was looking at it. So it wasn't, the lights weren't going across, the lights were coming down the ramp towards the viewer. And he could control the speed at which the lights illuminated. How fast did they illuminate? Now, what he would do is he would put someone on an exercise bike and have them looking at the lights, and they had a switch. And they had to watch the lights, and they had to hit the switch at the moment that the light closest to them went on. So imagine all the lights are white and the one closest to them is green. And as soon as they perceive that green light's going to go on, they hit the switch so that they could be coincidental with that light going on. Then he had the subjects riding the stationary bike at different levels of intensity. So working up towards different levels of VO2 max, right? And he looked at the error between the light going on and when they hit the switch. And what he discovered was that the higher the physiological load, the greater the error there
Yeah.
was in the timing of hitting that switch. So what it tells us is not only cognitive load affecting how we perform, but our physiological load is also at the same time affecting how we perform. So take a high physiological stress and a high cognitive load, and we're falling apart.
Yeah, I got to actually do that. I sold to Homeland Security one time a set of heart rate monitors, and we needed to validate at that time fit for duty. So we
Mhm.
took, there were also trying to prove that force training was essential for first year police officers. So we had the opportunity of comparing first year with SWAT. So we went to a shot house, and being, I've never shot firearms. So it was aerosol rifles. They were all pretty much in a scenario where they had to break the door down and save us from being kidnapped. So we were all, more or less in this room, back of the room. They had to break down the door and come in. So we strapped these guys up, and we had a telemetry system so we could see them. They had to make their way through uh, several barriers in a shot house, and they had to clear rooms. And we timed them, how long it took them, and we monitored their heart rates as they went through the whole section. Let's say that not only their heart rate's really high for the first year guys, um, as soon as they hit the area that we were testing, they went from, let's say, 80 to 100 beats, 180 beats per minute. We had cameras on them as well. Uh, when we reported back after all the data that we collected, they disputed it. Oh, I didn't drop my walkie-talkie, or I didn't drop my flashlight, or it's like, dude, we have you on camera. It's like,
Yeah, right.
so
Exactly.
you physically saw it was like, and it's not exactly exercise related, right? It's just the physiological response that people need to understand.
Mhm,
That physiological response is a stress response. So you're
mhm.
talking about that area of the brain, the parietal lobe, that is responsible for coordination for where you are in space, and you're clearing rooms. And I just, people want to know. I mean, SWAT teams' heart rates never really broke above 80.
They're
They clear,
conditioned.
yeah, they've been in
Yeah.
this. Oh, so it's also, to your point, their brain learns that, like, they know that scenario. They have that experience. And you see that today in sports too. It's like the difference between winning teams and losing teams. They've seen it. They've prepared for that situation itself, so it's not novel. So there's less margin of error. So
Yeah, that experience that we have with any particular task helps us to control it as we continue to do it. There's an Olympic sport, the biathlon, which, may seem like a fairly mundane sport. It's a combination of Nordic skiing and shooting. You're like,
yeah,
oh, what's that? I mean, but the reality is, they're skiing for kilometers. Their
yes,
heart rate's up, their cortisol levels are up, their adrenaline's up, they're really at a high state of arousal, and then they have to go fire a rifle at a tiny little target. I mean, that to me is the epitome of what we're talking about. Like, you're
yeah.
overloading someone physiologically and then asking them to perform a task with a super high level of precision. It's phenomenal. I mean, watching these people do it is really incredible.
It is, especially what they've learned, coping mechanisms to reduce that stress, right? So some of it is breathing techniques, some of it is visualization, some of it is actually purposely slowing down and knowing when to pick up their pace in that route. So they know by the time that they get to that shooting station, I'm already climbing down from my high heart rate effort, because I had to, like, break it to 175 to get up that hill. And then as I'm coming down, oh, okay. And sometimes they'll put the shooting responsibility at the top of the hill. So how do I regulate that? So yeah, it's really cool to be able to see some of these athletes do that.
Hmm.
I just feel like people need to understand, like, how do you, like, so let's talk about some takeaways here. So if someone's going to program this, we kind of already talked about, you don't do this all the time, you dose this. Obviously, there's some prerequisites, right, for this. We want to make sure that they're um, have a good baseline, so they actually have done some strength training for 6 to 12 weeks, ideally, right? So we know that they're competent, have a movement library, have done loaded exercise for a period of time. So, what does dual task progression look like after that? Uh, so want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, look, when from a motor learning perspective, there are generally three phases of learning. The first one is what we call the cognitive phase. Cognitive phase is when someone's figuring out what it is they need to do in the first place. Like, you give someone an exercise, the first time they do it, they've got to, like, what is this? What am I doing? Where am I going? How am I moving? I mean, that's never the time to introduce anything like this. And what you can see when someone's performing exercises in the cognitive phase is that it's really jerky, it's disjointed, it looks uncoordinated, the mechanics are off. And, our first instinct as a trainer is to fix everything.
Yeah.
But you don't have to. I mean, you can let people work it out to a certain extent and they will fix it, which means they're getting into the next phase, which is called the associative phase. And in the associative phase, what they're doing is they're saying, okay, I've got this movement that I pretty much understand, but I need to tweak it and I need to refine it and I need to get it smooth. And what happens then is you start to see these movements smooth out a little bit. The person looks a little more comfortable, more confident. And then they're like, okay, now they're getting this. And then the last phase is what we call autonomous. It means they could do it without thinking about it, right? It's when they're transitioning from that associative control to autonomous function, that's when you want to start introducing this stuff. And you don't go right to the kitchen sink. And this is what I see a lot of people doing is you want to multitask and you just throw everything in the world at somebody. And that's just not the way to do this. Start with a single ball and, moving it around. And basically the only time that I'm really going to use a BOSU, I don't like using BOSUs. I'm not a fan. But the one scenario where I will is if I want to get someone to really be stable under an unstable condition. They're not doing squats on it. They're just standing and stabilizing, and they're going to catch a ball. And we'll play catch. And then I'll throw the ball in different directions. And then I'll change the speeds, right? And then maybe I'll get a basketball. And then we'll do the same thing. And then sometimes I'll bounce it. And sometimes I'll throw it over their head. So that's an example of taking someone with a very simple object in a controlled environment and introducing a multitask, introducing a secondary task to it. The other thing you can do is take away someone's vision. So have them do an exercise without seeing where they're moving. So now you're removing what we call exteroception. Exteroception is using your eyes to see where your body is in space. You take that away, and now you're really dependent on proprioception and vestibular input. That changes the game. The other thing you can do is have someone performing a task while doing something that we call pursuit tracking. They're not actually catching an object, but they have to track an object through space. So you could have like a little target or something in your hand. You can use a blaze pod and move the lights around. And while they're doing the exercise, they have to track the lights or they have to track an object that you're putting in front of them. And that's a cognitive load. So all of these are different ways of challenging the sensory motor apparatus so that you increase the demand on cognitive function while you're doing some of these other tasks.
So I think the take home is this program design recommendation. We initially talked about a baseline. It's not the finish line. The structure really is about helping retrain and move at the same time and make sure that we address the liability or the churn risk in this case with that member or patient. So I think what I would like to do is invite facilities or clinics that want to build on cognitive load in their programming in the later stages and are not really looking at adding gimmicks. What we're trying to explain here is the actual gap between the controlled environment and the real world, right?
Mhm.
So I think, it's a great subject. I will include the study in the show notes itself. I want to thank everyone for this one. Thanks again, Paul.
My
Uh,
pleasure.
a- and I think if there's any questions about this, I would love to encourage people to reach out to us. Programming this is real simple. The workflows on your training floor are not reinventing things. It's really just a matter of education. So thanks for giving us a listen. And if you have any suggestions, please make sure to leave it in the comment section.
Thanks, Marcelo.